Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I can't help but to keep hammering on average inflation rate. A lot of times when we're listening to the economists out there, we're listening to the politicians, we're listening to even the Federal Reserve itself, we keep hearing about how the Federal Reserve is going for a 2% target inflation rate. This is false. This is completely wrong. They are not going for a 2% target. They are going for a 2% average inflation rate over time. And it makes a huge difference in where the Federal Reserve is going to be adjusting their monetary policy. It is very critical to understand this. Now, this is coming from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, dated April 6, 2021. So it is a little bit older paper, but it is showing exactly how the Federal Reserve has changed the way that they are viewing inflation targeting. They don't go for a 2% target, they go for a 2% average inflation rate over time. Listen to this. The 2007 through 9 global financial crisis packed an economic punch that led the Federal Reserve to its first ever monetary policy framework review. The Fed concluded this effort by announcing a major change in its monetary policy strategy, moving from what had been described as flexible inflation targeting to flexible average inflation targeting. The change reflects lessons learned over time and from other countries and represents an evolution of the framework to better adapt monetary policy to the challenges of a low inflation, low interest rate environment. So this was a major problem coming from the Federal Reserve, and that they knew that the 2% target inflation rate, that was no longer going to be an effective way to conduct their monetary policy. They had failed to achieve the 2% target after the great financial crisis, even with all the money printing that had taken place. A balance sheet expansion going from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion, and the Federal Reserve failed to achieve the 2% target inflation rate that they were looking for. Goes on to say this: the Federal Open Market Committee lowered its policy rate, the Fed funds rate, to near zero in response to the financial crisis. It also decided to keep an ample reserve in the banking system, changing the way monetary policy guides the Fed funds rate. The Fed also expanded its toolkit and communication practices with balance sheet policies supported by forward guidance. Right? This is them telling you exactly what it is that they plan on doing in order to get you to behave in a way that as if they had already conducted business. And this forward guidance totally worked for them too. We can expand onto that in a different video. The forward guidance refers to the commitment by the central bank on the future path of its policy. The FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, if people are wondering on that, they're the 12 voting members who vote on monetary policy. The FOMC issued its first long-run goals and policy strategy in 2002 and subsequently amended it in 2019. That statement included the Fed's first explicit commitment to an inflation rate of 2%, as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures. That strategy is often referred to as flexible inflation targeting. All right, here it comes. The changing U.S. economy. The Fed's most recent 2019 through 2020 review of its monetary policy framework, strategy, policy tools, and communication practices was motivated by growing awareness of structural transformations of the economy, including diminished sensitivity of inflation to resource slack. Now, this is something very interesting to think about, because back then they were having very, very difficult time finding the 2% inflation that they were looking for, and they knew that it was an issue even after all the quantitative easing. All right, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Countries around the world had similar experiences. Recent research suggests that the downward shift in long-term inflation expectations and the disinflationary pressures arising from diminishing price power and globalization have been important factors holding down inflation. This was their major problem. They could not find the inflation they were looking for. Another important structural changes is decline in the natural rate of interest. The real rate consistent with full employment and inflation at its target. Estimate of the natural interest rate in the U.S. have fallen notably from their pre-2007 to 2009 recession levels above 2% to less than 1%. So what they are saying is that the neutral interest rate, this is the rate in which that the Federal Reserve is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy, that 2% is which that they had typically had assumed it was at, had fallen down to around 1%. This was making it very difficult for the Federal Reserve to operate their monetary policy to drop interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. They just simply couldn't do it anymore once that neutral interest rate and the Fed funds rate had achieved that zero lower bound. All right, the decline in the natural rate is a worldwide phenomenon resulting in population aging, slowing productivity growth, and globalization. These were the three major problems. They reiterate this many, many times in their speeches, and we'll cover that in another video. But if you follow the Uneducated Economist, especially when it comes to the membership videos and the live streams, we cover these speeches, and they refer to those three major problems consistently within them. All right. A decline in the natural rate reduces the space to stimulate the U.S. economy through interest rate cuts from the Fed funds rate, leaving the Fed more reliant on other policy tools such as balance sheet expansion and forward guidance. Or they say balance sheet policies, but when I mean expansion, that's like if you hit the lower bound, you can't drop interest rates anymore. You just have to go into a bunch of stimulus spending, and they usually give that accommodation from the government by doing the quantitative easing. So when they're buying up a bunch of treasuries, that's usually giving the government the ability to spend a lot of money. Again, this is really complicated stuff, but I just wanted to get this one out and share this with you guys because it's very important to understand this stuff. All right. Through the cuts, the Fed funds rate, leaving the Fed more reliant on policy tools such as balance sheet policies and forward guidance. The likelihood of being constrained by the effective lower bound, that is, when interest rates cannot fall below zero, is greater in low interest rate environments. So this is the major problem. They had interest rates very low. The lower bound was, now in effect, they couldn't get interest rates to go any further, and they were running out of monetary stimulus powers, right? They could just no longer stimulate the economy with their monetary policies. The Fed's strategy change, acknowledging a new environment. Fed Jerome Powell announced the more significant changes resulting from the Fed's monetary policy framework review on August 27, 2020. And now that particular speech is right here, August 27, 2020, right? And it's titled The New Economic Challenges for the Fed's Monetary Policy Review. And now in this speech, the statement of long-run goals and policy strategy explicitly acknowledges the challenges posed by the proximity of interest rates to the effective lower bound, right? This problem of hitting zero interest rates by reducing the Fed's scope to support the economy. They just couldn't do it anymore with their monetary policies, right? To support the economy through interest rate cuts. The lower bound increases downward risk to employment and inflation. The statement also highlights that the Fed is prepared to use its full range of tools to achieve its dual mandate objectives, stable prices and maximum sustainable employment. Notably, the Fed changed its language on inflation. This is super important. This is the whole point of this video right now. The Fed changed its language on inflation, replacing 2% inflation targeting or target commitment, and instead it will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Very big difference. When you hear people say that the Federal Reserve has achieved their 2% target, there is no target. They do not care about the 2% target. It doesn't exist in their mind. It doesn't exist for monetary policy. This is very important. Most people are missing this right now, right? The Fed changed its language on inflation, replacing it with 2% inflation target commitment, and instead said it will seek to achieve an inflation that averages 2% over time. This change is a substantial departure from the previous flexible inflation targeting regime. Substantial departure. It's not the same environment. They're not doing it the same way anymore. People miss this. They have missed this information. Monetary policy under inflation targeting was symmetric. The Fed would equally respond to overshooting and undershooting of the target. The Fed lets bygones be bygones, since it does not attempt to make up for past inflation deviations from target. This is the way they used to conduct themselves. By comparison, average inflation targeting means that policymakers would consider those deviations and can allow inflation to modestly and temporarily run above the target to make up for the past shortfalls, or vice versa. Okay, guys, if you really enjoyed this information, we break this stuff down all the time. Consider joining the live stream. We're doing one tonight on monetary policies. This is Michelle Bowman's speech. It's $1 a month to join the channel. It's just $1 for you, but it's everything to me. And I am putting a lot of work in here to try and understand and break this down so that everybody can really have a conversation and understand it for themselves. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider joining the channel. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.